Hi, I'm Seb, or possibly Seb's doppelganger, because that is the topic of today's video. Doppelgangers, doubles, we don't have enough of them, of this literary device in the world, I think, because it's just great, and which is why I absolutely want to know in the comments straight away your favorite doppelganger book to recommend me. But anyway, before we get to all that, why am I talking about doppelgangers? It's because of this book, Babel, Babel. I think Babel, maybe. But yeah, when around the time this came out here in Ireland, I put a reserve on it on the library, and surprisingly, I got it like straight away because I expected to get it like sometime next year because that's how usually there's a big queue for on the reserve system. But I got it like immediately, which meant that all the reserves kind of piled up, and I was like, oh my god, I have to read this in the space of like just a couple weeks, and I haven't managed to do that. I dropped everything else that I was reading basically, and tried to get to this. I got to page 110. I'm really enjoying it so far. It's what they call dark academic fantasy. I haven't read a fantasy in ages, and the reason I picked this up is because I saw a BookTube interview with Rebecca Kuang, the writer, and she seemed really cool. And it was an old interview, and she talked about how she was writing this book, and so the book just came out, so it was great timing. And I haven't read fantasy in ages, and it just looks really cool. It's got little maps of her fictional Oxford and her fictional Oxford Institute of Language, which is also called Babel. But yeah, it's about like kind of this university in Oxford University in 1836, I think. I think that's the year where I am at the moment. And it's a sort of alternate universe with magic, and the magic is to do with language. And like little bars of silver. But I was really enjoying loads of aspects of it. Her writing is great. The story is moving forward at a really good pace. But it was just like, it was starting to get a bit too much like post-colonial Harry Potter, which isn't a bad thing in itself. I really like the post-colonial part of it. But it's also like just like I felt a bit, like by the numbers post-colonial Harry Potter, if that makes sense. Like it didn't feel kind of like there was anything very particularly like startling about it once I got into the vibe of what it was, except for the doppelganger. She introduces the doppelganger just when I was starting to get like kind of worried that I'd sussed the book and I knew exactly the kind of thing it was going to be. Then suddenly we get a doppelganger, and that makes everything kind of uneasy, strange. Who is this doppelganger? Why are they in this world? What kind of person are they? And what is their role in events? And how does our main character, who's quite I guess like kind of passive person, react to his double? And so like, yeah, it's and once we quickly start to learn more about the doppelganger and learn like kind of why he's a doppelganger, and like, and that doesn't take away, it only kind of adds to the interesting dimensions. And I was thinking about, what's the nice thing about doppelgangers is that they provide an alternate version of the main character, like a different role that like they could take, or like a different path that they could take in the story. And in this one, it very much, the doppelganger offers sort of like a choice for the main character, like which path are you going to take at this university. And it's and it gives a whole dimension to the book, which makes it really interesting to me. And it's a shame that I have to return it tonight. I have to go back to the library tonight, and return the book, because I thought I might be able to finish the whole thing, but I'm enjoying it, so I wouldn't want to rush it anyways. So I'm going to return it, and then I'm going to go back to the back of the queue and probably going to get it back again sometime next year, maybe like in the spring. I reckon I'll get it in the spring. Unless I buy it. But that's not the only doppelganger I've been reading recently. Also, in this book, Tama, by Mieko Kanai, I've been reading this book for ages, even though it's so slim, because it's very kind of meaty. It's about, well, to give you a sense of it, at the bit where I'm at the moment, and where it's been for a while, is there's 3 people living in an apartment. One of them is our narrator, and it's his apartment. And there was a girl that he slept with, and that he like heard from that she's pregnant, but she says the baby isn't his, but he's ended up with her cat instead, so he's taking care of the cat, and that's his role in the story so far. Then there's somebody else who also slept with the same woman, a possible father for the unknown child, and he is staying with our narrator, and then a third person who is the brother of the woman, the half brother of the woman, who's called Tsuneko. The woman's called Tsuneko, but she's not in the story at all. It's just these sort of men around her. But then we discover that actually the guy who's come from Kyoto, who's the potential father, is also the half brother of our narrator, and our narrator finds this out, but it's kind of awkward, so he doesn't say it, and then only later that gets revealed to the other guy. And the way that things are revealed are like in really small little sentences that you have to like be paying attention, and you kind of feel, wait, did I hear that before? Wasn't that? And then you sort of like realize that there's this sort of doubling going on. And then it turns out as well, there's this suspicion that the brother isn't actually the brother, and maybe there wasn't even a pregnancy, but this guy is actually her lover, and he's getting like kind of money out of people who are potentially the father, and it's all a scam or something like that. So that's another possible story. But the fact that they've slept with the same woman, there's all this. There might be potential fathers. There's sort of for a while potential brothers, and then definitely half brothers. There's all these sort of similarities that like align the men in different ways, and different characters as well. So they're not like traditional proper doppelgangers, and they don't look anything like each other. But for me, they're like doppelgangers because they give you that sense of uneasiness, where it's like one personality and one kind of character's core traits seem to be repeated in other people around him, and that for me is sort of basically what a doppelganger's function is usually. It's got a sort of like comedy aspect to it, of the way that like these sort of these unlikely coincidences start stacking up, but also an uncanny one in the way that when coincidences stack up, we start to feel like there's something something is off, like that's sort of like what Freud, I think, calls the uncanny. Is that if you get loads of coincidences that start stacking up, we start to feel that there's something, something wrong with the world. We feel like unease. And so this kind of like, deliberately puts comedy and unease together in a really interesting way. I'm still not 100% sure what I think about it. It's taken me a long time to read, which also is not very ploddy, it's not a very ploddy novel. I really appreciate what she's doing with the tone, in that like she's making this weird blend of comedy and unease and eeriness, and just also just like kind of chilling out people who are hanging out with each other, but like we keep getting the sense that their characters overlap in ways that are kind of not normal, like kind of very kind of strange fundamental ways. Especially with their like relationships with women, like their mothers and their lovers and so on. But that's Tama. Then a more traditional one, let's go back to fantasy with Wizard of Earthsea. This one I read when I was probably too young to really appreciate it. I didn't really like it that much, to be honest, when I read it. This is a fantasy story about a wizard who goes to a wizarding school and gets a scar, and then the evil thing that gives him the scar, like every time he comes close, the scar hurts. And apparently there's like a bazillion ways that Harry Potter got like lots of inspiration from this, as well as other fantasy. But yeah, one of the key things about this one is that his spell that goes wrong at the school creates a sort of shadow version of himself, which pursues him across the world. And one of the things that struck me, I think, when I read it when I was young, was, for me, fantasy was, I guess, like mostly like Lord of the Rings and Narnia. And in those stories, like characters are usually, they have a destination, so they're moving through a fantastical world to get to somewhere or to meet someone, right? There's like, that's why they move through the world. Whereas in this one, the guy's like moving through the world largely because he's being pursued, right? There's like, it's almost like a chase. That's what I remember of it anyways. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. For Ged or Jed, I think it's Ged is his name, who's the main character. He's in this world where if you know something's name, you can have power over it. But the sort of the question is like, does this shadow creature have a name at all? Because like someone, I think, tells him it doesn't, which means he has to find a different way to overcome it. Or maybe it does have a name, in which case, how does he discover that name to have mastery over it? So this sort of like the main theme of naming things and having power over things through words, through language. Again, sort of like Babel as well. That Babel maybe owes a debt there, I don't know. But yeah, that was like a sort of like key. That was a standout thing, I think, about Wizard of Earthsea as well. And then yeah, moving on to another fantasy, Coraline. This is kind of a weird one again, because Coraline doesn't have a doppelganger, but she finds a door which takes her into a mirror world of her house where there are doppelgangers of everyone except for her. Oh yeah, also the cat. The cat isn't doubled, which I think is kind of important later. But there's another father and another mother, and the neighbors as well, who live in the same building. They're all doppelgangered in this other world, and the only difference is that their eyes are buttons, black buttons. Instead of eyes, they've got buttons where sewn into to their faces, which is just like a lovely creepy touch. And it gives you that sense as well that everything, like what the doppelganger does is it sort of looks just like a certain person, but there's something off about them. It means that, like, because they're obviously not that person really, so we should be suspicious, right? We should feel unease, and Coraline does that really well. And part of the fun of Coraline, I think it's Coraline actually. I always said Coraline when I was growing up, so like now that I know it's Coraline, I get them mixed up. But yeah, part of the fun of that book is sort of figuring out what the world is, the other world is, why the doppelgangers are there, and also discovering that the doppelgangers have different kind of status, because there's like a different types of doppelgangers in that world, but we won't go into too much of that here. Suffice to say, it's just a great doppelganger story. Now, my favorite, probably my favorite one, almost definitely my favorite one, Gil Martin from the private, let's see if I can do this, the Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. So this is a Gothic novel where our main character, Robert Ringham, is brought up as a Calvinist, but sort of like a very, very extreme religious, like fundamentalist version of Calvinism. He's brought up to believe there's an elect number of people who will be allowed into heaven, and once those ones are chosen, then it doesn't matter what they do on earth, whether they sin or not, they're going to go to heaven. Their role is to sort of guide other people to do well, but like everything is sort of predetermined, right? But the thing is that on the day that his adopted father, who's also a reverend, tells him that he is one of the elect, God has spoken to the reverend and said that this boy is going to be definitely one of the elect. His place is guaranteed. On that same day, he goes out feeling overwhelmed, like overjoyed, relieved, and he meets someone who has the same face as him. And this person is called Gil Martin, we learn. And we start to find out more about Gil Martin, and like similar to Coraline, one of the best things about this book is trying to figure out the nature of the doppelganger, because you start to think you've got it, and you're like, oh, okay, he's that thing, and then something else happens which makes you go, wait a minute, is he really? He's also just like really evil, which is always just fun to read. But trying to find out like who or what Gil Martin actually is like kind of a very like powerful part of that book, I would say. The book also kind of doppelgangers itself, because it tells the same story twice. First of all, you get a narrative which is an editor who is sort of compiling the events as seen externally from different people, and writing an account of certain things that happened around the life of Robert Ringham. And then the second part is a booklet which is called, it's the Confessions of Robert Ringham, and that is the Confessions of the Justified Sinner. So then it's all like kind of first person, and it's all like the internal psychological version of what happened, and that's the second half of the novel, and that's like kind of like fills in all the gaps that were in the first part, and also creates new gaps as well. It's just a great book. Interestingly, on the topic of doppelgangers and this book, Robert Louis Stevenson, who of course wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which isn't a doppelganger. My God, I have to say that word so many times. Which isn't a doppelganger book. He read this book and said that he was really haunted by it, and that he was really puzzled by it after he read it, like for his whole life. So it makes sense, kind of, that someone who was sort of haunted and puzzled by this mysterious doppelganger thing would write a book like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which isn't about a doppelganger, because the doppelganger is two people who appear to be one person, whereas Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is one person who appears to be two people, right? So it's just a totally different vibe. But it's a sort of a puzzle which has a solution, and like a psychological solution, which is sort of, it's sort of answering the puzzles that are put forward in the private confessions. But the mystery and the dissatisfaction is honestly just better to just have that, you know what I mean? Who needs the answers? Who needs solutions? I mean, Robert Louis Stevenson apparently, but we don't, do we? We don't. Next up, another classic, Golyadkin, the titular counselor from The Double by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's called, the full title is The Double, or a St. Petersburg Poem, which I think is very nice. But yeah, The Double is like kind of the classic doppelganger story. I think it's this guy who's he's struggling in his work, in his sort of bureaucratic life, which is like he can't really get ahead in it. And I don't think he has any friends really, and he doesn't have social like kind of contacts, and he's kind of he's struggling, and then like he finds a version of himself. I think he sees him through the snow one day after like a really particularly terrible, stressful evening where like he makes lots of social faux pas and stuff like that. I think he gets kicked out of a party or something. But anyway, it's in the snow, and he sees himself, and this version of himself, this other Golyadkin, who's also called Golyadkin, comes in. They call him Golyadkin Jr., I think, in the text, which is kind of funny. But yeah, Golyadkin Jr. is very charming. He's suave. He's smiley. He makes friends easily. He's able to kind of like ingratiate himself in all the circles that the original Golyadkin has been trying to get into, like for years and years and years. And it's just this like kind of nightmarish vision of seeing another version of yourself being successful and doing all the things that you can't do for whatever social hang-ups that you have. And so yeah, I think it's supposed to be like, it's kind of like the most gothic Dostoevsky, and it's not my favorite one, but it's also the one that's most like Gogol. And so that's interesting, because Gogol is another absolute favorite writer of mine. So I really want to read The Double again as well. I haven't read that in years and years and years. But yeah, if you want sort of the definitive doppelganger story, that's probably it. There's also a movie which was made by the British comedian Richard Aoyama, and it's starring Jesse Eisenberg, and it's actually really good. I really enjoy it. The ending was kind of like take it or leave it, or leave it maybe, but the vibes are really great, and Jesse Eisenberg, as the double is really, really good. I think if like the idea of reading a big Russian classic is daunting, then maybe watch the film first and see what you think. Although they're quite different, obviously. Next one I thought of was actually from Hamlet, and like this isn't like a proper doppelganger. There's no proper doppelganger in Hamlet, even though the ghost of his father, who starts the whole shenanigan thing, is called Hamlet as well, and he's kind of eerie and spooky because he's a ghost. But he's not a doppelganger. The person that is more like for me is sort of like a doppelganger is Laertes. And also, just no one talks about Laertes, I think, enough. People talk about all the characters in Hamlet. They never talk about Laertes. So I'm here to, give him some love, because Laertes is great. So, like, Hamlet's dad is murdered, right? And then the ghost comes and tells Hamlet, go avenge me by killing your uncle who killed me. And so Hamlet then spends the whole play thinking, oh, should I, shouldn't I don't know, maybe it wasn't a ghost, or maybe it was like a demon disguised as my father, which is kind of legit, I think, to be honest. But then he does through all these tests and finds out that, yeah, definitely Claudius is definitely the murderer. And he finds out again and again, and he still can't do it. He can't bring himself to do it. He's always finding an excuse to put it off. And then, and throughout all this, he ends up accidentally murdering Laertes' dad, and being really cruel and abusive to Laertes' sister, and who kills herself. And so then Laertes comes home, and Laertes also, we see at the very beginning, had a strong kind of relationship with his father and his sister. So obviously he's really distraught. And then also, like, at the grave, when Ophelia is being put into the grave, and he's like mourning his dead sister, Hamlet like jumps in, like I think he literally jumps in the grave and starts like kind of mocking Laertes and being like, oh, look at you mourning your sister, you think you're so good, I mourn her more, I'm Hamlet, I'm really sad, you're not really sad. And it's just like, it's like, he's got so many reasons to kill Hamlet, and like I feel like who wouldn't at this point, right? I feel like we should all be rooting for Laertes really at this point. But yeah, the doubling comes in because Claudius, the uncle, manipulates Laertes to, like, with this really wacky murder scheme to get Hamlet back. And Laertes just says, yeah, I'll do it straight away. I'll do it. And he instantly goes in for the scheme, and then he sort of doubts it and regrets it. It goes all wrong. Everybody dies. So basically in the play, Hamlet doesn't avenge his dead father. So that's his flaw, that he's sort of like always pontificating and not able to be a man of action. But then we see a man of action come in at the end who just acts really rashly. And that's also a terrible thing. So Laertes is super important because he shows us that there's no easy answer to Hamlet, It's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Even if you don't for the whole play, you're damned if you do at the very end of the play as well. So that's why I think like it's like he's in a way like the other path that Hamlet could have taken, like instant revenge, like also seems to have been like a really bad idea. So yeah, Laertes and Hamlet are sort of interesting, like kind of doppelgangery pair, I think, although obviously not really doppelgangers. Another one who's not really a doppelganger, but I want to talk about her anyways because I feel like she needs to be talked about, is Nephele from the Greek myth. I'm not sure what book or text this is originally mentioned in. I read it on Wikipedia first, so you can read it there. But Nephele is such an interesting character, I think. She is a cloud. Originally, Nephele does mean just cloud, apparently, in ancient Greek. And the way that she comes into being is because Zeus suspects that this mortal guy called Ixion was coveting his wife, Hera. And, you know, that's not okay. So what Zeus does to sort of like test this guy Ixion, is he gets the cloud and he makes it into Hera. Like he makes it look exactly like Hera. And then he puts this fake Hera down on Earth next to Ixion, who's like kind of sleeping. And he wakes up and he finds this woman lying next to him and he rapes her, which is really horrible, obviously. And then Zeus goes, aha! You see, you would have raped my wife if you could have, so you're a terrible person because that's my wife and you were my guest, and you know, that's all like kind of honor and men and stuff like that, and hosts and guests, and oof, really bad. Never mind the actual woman involved, but like, you know, all that like kind of social rules that were being broken there are terrible. So he ties Ixion to a giant flaming wheel and throws him through the sky, where he will burn forever, which is nice. But then what's interesting is that, yeah, Nephele's still there and she ends up going off and like marrying somebody and she has kids, and she doesn't have much that happens in her story, but her children end up being very important in different Greek myths, and her husband as well. But just the fact that like that she persists through Greek mythology, I think is really interesting, because I always kind of wonder what would her perspective be. You know, like she is someone who looks exactly like the queen of the gods, and she's on Earth, and she's a cloud, and she's, you know, like she's brought into sort of mortal existence just to sort of settle a score and to be raped, which is really horrible, like as a trap for a man. And yeah, like what would her perspective be on all this? Like I really want like a feminist Greek retelling to do like Nephele the story sometime soon. Maybe we're gonna get one of those eventually. But yeah, in the meantime, that's the Nephele story. And yeah, she's not a doppelganger in the traditional sense because she doesn't have that unease thing that they're supposed to do. But she is, I think, really interesting in that like she is a double of somebody else. You know, and like what is she? What is like that the sort of the question of what is this double is the doppelganger question, and like I think it applies to Nephele as well. But yeah, those are all the doppelgangers I know, and obviously I've stretched the rules quite a lot for some of them. But I mean that's because I don't know enough. I don't know enough, many examples of this wonderful literary technique. So please give me your examples down below in the comments so I can go read those books. And yeah, I've been Seb, or possibly Seb 2, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye bye!